The security camera didn't miss a thing. It recorded every second, every movement as the white police officer stood in full uniform, pointing his finger in a black man's face like he had already decided he was guilty. The black man didn't back down. He kept his palms open, his body calm, and his eyes locked forward. Next to him, his wife was screaming, not because they had done anything wrong, but because she couldn't believe what she was watching happen to her husband in broad daylight. And right there in the middle of all of it, sitting completely still, was a shopping cart packed with groceries, bags, items, and a receipt that proved they had paid for every single thing in it. Officer Brandon Pitt saw a threat that Sunday afternoon. What he didn't see, what he never bothered to find out, was that the man he was pointing at had argued human rights cases in front of international courts, that he had testified before Congress, that he had spent his entire career fighting for people who looked exactly like him, in moments that looked exactly like this one. Peter Wilson wasn't just a black man with a shopping cart. He was a human rights attorney. And Officer Pitt had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. It was the story of 4 seconds that exposed 9 years of abuse, and a man who made the entire system pay for it. And if you're new here, hit subscribe right now. Also tell us where you're watching from. We tell stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. It started the way most good Sundays did. Slowly, quietly, without any kind of plan. Peter Wilson woke up that morning with nothing more dangerous on his mind than what to cook for dinner. He and Mary had been married for 11 years, and somewhere along the way, Sunday grocery runs had become their thing. Not romantic, not exciting, just theirs. An hour away from case files, court deadlines, and the weight of other people's battles. Just 2 people pushing a cart through the vegetable aisle, arguing about whether they actually needed more olive oil when there was already a half-full bottle at home. They needed it, Mary insisted. Peter disagreed. They bought it anyway. That was how their Sundays worked. Peter was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, and moved through the world with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades knowing exactly what to say and exactly when to say it. He had argued cases in front of federal judges. He had sat across tables from government officials who didn't want to hear what he had to say and made them listen anyway. He had flown to Geneva twice in 1 year to consult with United Nations committees on human rights violations. He had testified before Congress at the age of 36 and barely broke a sweat. But none of that was on his mind that Sunday. That Sunday, he was just thinking about dinner. Mary walked beside him the way she always did, slightly ahead, pulling things off shelves before Peter could talk her out of them, dropping items into the cart with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding a household for years and had no time for debate. She was a high school science teacher, sharp and warm in equal measure, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and never let anyone leave her house hungry. She laughed easily. She argued harder. They made their way through the store aisle by aisle, produce, dairy, meat, canned goods. Mary held the list on her phone. Peter pushed the cart and added things that weren't on the list. They bickered gently about it and kept moving. By the time they reached the checkout line, the cart was full. A proper week's worth of groceries. Chicken, vegetables, rice, the olive oil nobody asked for, a box of cereal Peter picked out himself, and a bar of chocolate Mary slipped in at the last second without saying a word about it. Peter noticed. He said nothing. That was the deal. The cashier rang everything up. Peter paid. The receipt printed, long, detailed, itemized, and he folded it once and tucked it into the paper bag sitting on top of the cart. They walked out through the automatic doors together, Mary still scrolling her phone, Peter steering the cart toward the parking lot with one hand. The air outside was cool. The sky was clear. It was a perfectly ordinary Sunday afternoon. They had no idea that 20 steps from the exit, everything was about to change. They had no idea that someone was already watching them. Officer Brandon Pitt had been sitting in his patrol car for about 12 minutes when he saw them come out. He wasn't responding to a call. There was no report of suspicious activity, no alert sent over the radio, no reason whatsoever for his attention to move in their direction. He was parked at the edge of the lot the way officers sometimes parked, engine idling, window cracked, watching the general movement of people coming in and out of the store. Routine presence, the department would later call it. A deterrent. What happened next was not deterrence. It was a decision. He watched Peter Wilson pushed the cart through the exit and into the open air of the parking lot. He watched Mary walking beside him. He watched the loaded cart, the bags, the easy pace of two people heading back to their car after a regular shopping trip. And somewhere in those few seconds of watching, Brandon Pitt decided that something was wrong. Not because anyone had told him something was wrong. Not because he had seen anything happen inside the store. Not because there was a single observable fact that pointed toward any kind of crime. He decided something was wrong because of what he saw. And what he saw, the evidence would later make devastatingly clear, was a black man in a parking lot. That was it. That was the whole calculation. Investigators who reviewed the case later would describe Pitt's decision-making as a textbook example of racial profiling. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't feel like bias to the person doing it, because it has been repeated so many times it feels like instinct. Pitt would later claim he received a report of a possible shoplifting incident in the area. No such report existed in the system. There was no record of any call, no log, no timestamp connecting him to any credible reason to approach the Wilsons. What the records did show was a pattern. 9 years of it. In the 12 months prior to that Sunday alone, Pitt had conducted 41 stops in that district. 31 of those stops involved black individuals. The district itself was majority white. The math was not subtle. Supervisors had seen the numbers. Complaints had been filed, 6 of them in the previous 3 years alone, all citing the same behavior, all describing the same feeling of being targeted without cause. Every single complaint had been reviewed. Every single one had been closed without action. The department had seen Brandon Pitt's pattern and decided, over and over again, that it didn't rise to the level of a problem. So Pitt kept doing what he had always done. He opened his car door, adjusted his belt, and walked across the parking lot toward Peter and Mary Wilson with the calm, unhurried stride of a man who had never once been told to stop. He had done this before, many times, and nothing had ever happened to him. That was the most dangerous part of all. Not the bias itself, but the years of silence around it that had convinced him there would be no consequences. He crossed that parking lot like a man who believed he was untouchable. He was about to find out what happened when he was wrong. Peter noticed him first. He had spent 20 years studying power, how it moved, how it presented itself, how it chose its targets. So when he saw Officer Brandon Pitt walking toward them with that particular kind of purposeful stride, he knew before a single word was spoken exactly what kind of moment this was becoming. He slowed the cart. He straightened up. He kept his hands visible without making a show of it, because he had advised enough clients to know that the first thing you did was remove every possible excuse from the equation. Mary looked up from her phone. She looked at Pitt. She looked at Peter. She understood immediately, too. Pitt didn't greet them. He didn't introduce himself with any warmth or open a conversation with a question. He led with his presence. Uniform, badge, the full physical authority of the state, and pointed his finger directly at Peter. He wanted to know where the groceries came from. Peter told him. They had just come from inside. They had paid at the register. He reached into the bag on top of the cart and held out the receipt. Pitt didn't take it. He didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Peter and asked him to step away from the cart. That was the moment Mary's voice broke through. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't asking politely. She stepped forward and told Pitt in plain, direct language that they had paid for everything in that cart, that she had the receipt right there in her hand, and that there was absolutely no reason for any of this. Her voice was shaking, not from fear, but from a specific kind of fury that comes from watching someone you love be treated as guilty before a single fact has been checked. Pitt told her to step back. By now, 3 people in the parking lot had stopped walking. 2 of them pulled out their phones without hesitating. One of them, a woman loading bags into her trunk 10 feet away, turned and started recording immediately. She said later that she had seen this before in a different city with different people, and she was not going to look away again. Peter did not raise his voice. He did not move aggressively. He did not give Pitt a single thing that could be used to justify what was already happening. He stood with his palms open at his sides, feet planted, jaw set, and spoke in the measured tone of a man who was simultaneously furious and completely in control of it. Every inch of his body was communicating the same message. He knew exactly what this was. He stated his name. He stated that he had a receipt. He stated that he did not consent to a search and that he was asking clearly and for the record whether he was being detained and on what legal basis. Pitt told him to put his hands behind his back. The woman by the trunk kept recording. The cart sat between them, full of groceries, receipt visible, completely unbothered, the quietest and most honest witness in the entire parking lot. When Pitt went through Peter's wallet, he didn't have to look hard. It was all right there, organized, clear, impossible to misread. Peter Wilson carried his identification the way any professional did. Driver's license in the front slot, and right behind it, 2 cards that should have ended everything the moment Pitt's eyes landed on them. The first was his Virginia State Bar Association card, identifying him as a licensed, active attorney in good standing. The second was a state-issued credential connected to his nonprofit legal practice, his name, his title, his photograph, the official seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia printed cleanly across the front. Pitt looked at both of them. He put them back in the wallet, and he continued the detention anyway. That moment, those few seconds where Brandon Pitt held the evidence of exactly who Peter Wilson was and chose to proceed regardless, became the centerpiece of everything that followed. It was the moment that transformed a bad stop into something far more deliberate and far harder to defend. Lawyers who later reviewed the case said it was the single most damaging piece of the puzzle, not just because it showed bias, but because it showed conscious bias. He didn't miss the cards. He didn't overlook them. He saw them, processed them, and decided they didn't change anything. In a deposition taken 7 months later, Pitt was asked directly about that moment. He said he couldn't verify the cards were legitimate on the scene. He said anyone could carry a bar card. He said he was following protocol. The jury heard that answer. They didn't forget it. What Pitt's explanation could not account for was the testimony of every psychologist, law enforcement expert, and civil rights scholar who took the stand to explain what that kind of decision-making actually looks like from the inside. One expert described it plainly. When authority figures have spent years operating without accountability, the brain begins to filter evidence through the lens of the conclusion it has already reached. Pitt had decided Peter was guilty in the parking lot before he ever touched that wallet. By the time he found the bar card, his mind wasn't looking for reasons to stop. It was looking for reasons to continue. That is what unchecked authority does over time. It stops asking questions. It stops being curious. It replaces judgment with certainty, and certainty with the kind of confidence that can look directly at the truth and keep walking right past it. Peter Wilson understood all of this before he ever filed a lawsuit. He had written about this exact psychological mechanism in a legal journal article published 2 years prior. He had explained it to students. He had used it to win cases for other people. Now he was living inside it, hands behind his back, watching an officer hold his credentials and feel absolutely nothing shift. Mary stood a few feet away, watching it happen. She said later that the worst part wasn't the detention itself. The worst part was the moment she realized that nothing they had, not the receipt, not the credentials, not the truth, was going to matter to this man. That was the moment she understood they were going to have to take this somewhere else entirely. The first video was posted at 4:47 in the afternoon. It was 43 seconds long, slightly shaky, shot from the angle of a woman standing beside her car with her phone pressed against her chest to keep it steady. It showed the end of the confrontation. Pitt's finger, Peter's open hands, Mary's voice rising above the sound of parking lot traffic. It wasn't perfect footage, but it was enough. By 6 p.m., it had been shared 1,100 times. By 9 p.m., it was on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok simultaneously, spreading through feeds and group chats and comment sections with the velocity of something that had touched a nerve too raw and too familiar to scroll past. People weren't just watching it. They were sending it to their parents, their siblings, their coworkers, their friends in other states, their friends in other countries, with the same 2 or 3 words attached every time. Watch this and this again, and nothing has changed. By midnight, the view count crossed 3.8 million. A second video surfaced around 10 p.m., longer, clearer, shot from a better angle by the other witness in the parking lot. It showed the moment Pitt went through Peter's wallet. It showed the bar card being handled and replaced. That video spread, even faster than the first. Cable news picked it up before sunrise. By Monday morning, Peter Wilson's name was on the front page of 3 national newspapers and leading the homepage of every major news outlet in the country. Anchors on CNN and MSNBC were reading his biography aloud on air. His Harvard degree, his UN consultancy work, his years of civil rights litigation, with a specific kind of emphasis that made clear they understood the full weight of the irony. This was not just a story about a man being wrongfully detained. This was a story about a man who had dedicated his entire professional life to fighting the exact thing that had just been done to him. The Alexandria Police Department said nothing. That silence became its own story. Journalists called the department's press line 17 times before noon on Monday. They received a single written statement acknowledging that the incident was under review. No apology. No suspensión announcement. No acknowledgement of Peter Wilson by name. The statement was 4 sentences long and said, effectively, nothing. The internet noticed. By Tuesday, the hashtag attached to the story had been used over 2 million times. Attorneys, activists, professors, and politicians were all speaking publicly. Several of Peter's former clients gave interviews describing what he had done for them and what it meant to watch this happen to him specifically. A congressman from Virginia issued a formal statement calling for an independent investigation. Peter Wilson himself said nothing publicly in those first 48 hours. He didn't post. He didn't call the press. He didn't perform outrage for an audience. He was already talking to his legal team. For the first time in his career, Peter Wilson was not the attorney preparing to walk into the fight. He was the client, and he was ready. If this story has you hooked, hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find this video. We're just getting to the best part. The number that stopped everyone in the room was 74. When investigators finally pulled Brandon Pitt's complete record, every stop, every detention, every field contact logged over his 9 years on the force, they didn't find a complicated picture. They found a very simple one. Out of 98 documented pedestrian and vehicle stops in a district where black residents made up less than 30% of the population, 74 of those stops involved black individuals. That was 76% of his stops falling on less than a third of the community. The math didn't require a statistician to understand. It required only a willingness to look directly at it without flinching. The investigators looked. They did not flinch. What made it worse, what transformed the numbers from troubling to catastrophic, was what sat alongside them in the file. 15 prior complaints. 15 separate occasions over 9 years when someone had taken the time, the energy, and the emotional courage to formally report Brandon Pitt for behavior they described in almost identical terms. Targeted without cause. Treated as suspicious without evidence. Spoken to as though guilt was already assumed before a single question was asked. 15 people had said, through the official channels the system provided, that something was wrong with this officer. 0 of those complaints had been sustained. Not one. In 9 years, across 15 documented grievances, the Alexandria Police Department's internal review process had looked at Brandon Pitt and decided, every single time, that he had done nothing wrong. Some complaints were closed within weeks. A few were logged and never formally reviewed at all. One investigating supervisor had written in his notes that the complainant's account lacked sufficient corroborating evidence. This about a stop that 3 witnesses had personally observed. The department hadn't just failed to stop Pitt. It had actively, repeatedly, and officially cleared him to keep going. Peter Wilson's legal team presented these findings during the pretrial discovery phase, and even the attorneys who had spent years working civil rights cases said they were struck by the density of it. This was not a file with gaps or ambiguities. This was a file that told one story consistently from beginning to end. One expert retained by the team described it during a pretrial hearing as among the clearest documented examples of institutionally enabled racial profiling she had reviewed in 20 years of work. The department's attorney argued that stop statistics alone could not prove discriminatory intent, that each incident had to be evaluated individually. That correlation was not causation. Peter had heard that argument before. He had watched other departments make it in other courtrooms. He knew exactly what it was designed to do, not to explain the numbers, but to exhaust the people trying to hold them accountable. To make the process long enough and technical enough that the human cost at the center of it got buried under procedure. He'd spent his career helping other people survive that strategy. Now he was the one in the middle of it, and he understood something he had perhaps known intellectually but never felt in his bones until that moment, that the numbers were never just numbers. Behind every stop in that file was a person who had stood exactly where he had stood in that parking lot, trying to hold themselves together while the system told them they were wrong to be upset. 74 people, at minimum, and those were only the ones who had been counted. They came forward one by one, and then all at once. The first call came into Peter's legal team 3 days after the videos went viral. A woman named Diane Carter, a registered nurse who worked the overnight shift at a hospital 12 minutes from the Whole Foods where Peter and Mary had been stopped. She had been pulled over by Brandon Pitt on a Tuesday evening in March of the previous year while driving home from work in her scrubs. He told her he had observed her making an improper lane change. She hadn't. She had a dash cam. The footage showed a clean, legal lane change executed well within the lines. Pitt had written her a citation anyway. She had tried to fight it. The process wore her down, and she eventually paid the fine and tried to move on. She said she thought about it every single time she drove that route, which was 5 days a week. The second call came from Dr. Raymond Okafor, a political science professor at a university 20 minutes away. Pitt had stopped him on foot outside a bookstore 2 years prior, telling him he matched the description of someone reported in the area. Dr. Okafor had asked what the description was. Pitt had not answered the question. He had instead asked for identification, held it for 11 minutes, and ultimately released Dr. Okafor without explanation or apology. Dr. Okafor had filed a formal complaint the following week. It was one of the 15. It had been closed in 18 days. Then came Marcus Green, not an adult professional with credentials and dashcam footage, but a 17-year-old boy who had been stopped by Brandon Pitt 4 separate times in a single calendar year. 4 times. Walking home from school, from a friend's house, from a corner store 2 blocks from where he lived. Each time, Pitt had approached him with the same posture and the same energy, asked the same questions, received the same answers, and eventually let him go. No charges, no cause, just 4 encounters that left a teenager afraid to walk his own neighborhood without his heart rate climbing every time he saw a patrol car. Marcus's mother was the one who called. She said her son had not slept well in 2 years. By the time Peter's legal team finished taking preliminary statements, they had documented 11 additional individuals willing to testify. A high school coach, a retired postal worker, 2 college students who had been stopped together. Each story was different in its details. Every single one was identical in its shape. A black person, no cause, Brandon Pitt, in an apartment that had looked the other way. In a civil case, patterns are everything. A single incident can be explained as a mistake, a miscommunication, an isolated moment of poor judgment. But 11 people telling the same story, with documentation, with timestamps, with dashcam footage and complaint numbers and closed investigation files. That was not a mistake. That was a system. Peter stood in his office the evening before the trial began and looked at the wall where his team had pinned every name, every date, every piece of evidence they had assembled over 8 months of preparation. He had built walls like this before for other clients in other cases. This time, his own name was on it too. He turned off the light and went home to Mary. Tomorrow, it was time to make the system answer for all of them. For the first time in his professional life, Peter Wilson walked into a federal courtroom and sat on the wrong side of the aisle. Not the wrong side in any moral sense. He had never been more certain of anything. But for 20 years, the plaintiff's chair had belonged to his clients. He was the one who sat at the attorney's table, the one who organized the files and framed the arguments and carried the weight of someone else's pain into a room designed to be cold and procedural and slow. He knew how to hold all of that. He had done it hundreds of times. Sitting on the receiving end of it was different in ways he had not fully anticipated. The trial lasted 6 days. Pitt's attorneys worked the strategy Peter had predicted, attacking the statistics, isolating each incident, arguing that good faith mistakes were not civil rights violations, and suggesting that Peter's public profile had turned a minor misunderstanding into a political event. They were professional. They were prepared. They were fighting a losing battle, and some of them, Peter thought, probably knew it. The witnesses came in order. Diane Carter described the dashcam footage the jury had already seen. Clean lane change. No violation. Citation written anyway. Dr. Okafor described standing outside a bookstore for 11 minutes holding the patience of a man who had learned that losing his temper would only make things worse. Marcus Green's mother testified about what it does to a child to be treated as a suspect in his own neighborhood before he is old enough to vote. Each testimony was composed and precise and quietly devastating. By the time Peter took the stand on the fifth day, the jury had already heard enough to understand what had happened. What they heard from Peter was something different, not just what had happened to him specifically, but what it meant. He had not performed grief. He did not ask for sympathy. He spoke the way he had always spoken in courtrooms, directly, clearly, without decoration. And he laid out in plain language what it felt like to spend your entire career defending people who looked like you from a system that had failed them, and then to stand in a parking lot on a Sunday afternoon and realize that all of that knowledge, all of those credentials, all of those years of work had not made him safe from the same thing. He said the most frightening moment was not the detention itself. It was when Pitt looked at his bar card and kept going anyway, because that meant this was never about proof. It was about power. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 14 minutes. They returned a verdict of $4.7 million. Peter sat in the plaintiff's chair and heard the number read aloud and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief, but a deep and aching recognition of how many people had sat in rooms like this one, in cases that had not gone this way, and walked out with nothing but the weight of what had been done to them. $4.7 million. For him. For his name on a filing. The system had finally answered. He was already thinking about who was next. Brandon Pitt was terminated from the Alexandria Police Department 11 days after the verdict. The letter cited conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of departmental equal protection policies, and a pattern of stops inconsistent with constitutional standards. It was 4 paragraphs long and contained no apology. His termination was followed within the same week by a formal referral to the Department of Justice for a federal civil rights investigation, one that would examine not just Pitt's individual conduct, but the department's decade-long practice of reviewing and clearing his complaints without meaningful action. 14 days after the verdict, the police chief announced his resignation. He did not frame it as accountability. He called it retirement, effective at the end of the month, and thanked the department for the opportunity to serve. The statement released by his office did not mention Peter Wilson, or the trial, or the 74 stops, or the 15 complaints, or the 17-year-old boy who had been afraid to walk home from school. The city did not let that silence stand unchallenged. The mayor announced a mandatory overhaul of all stop and detain protocols within the department, including the introduction of real-time demographic tracking for every officer stop, data that would be reviewed monthly, published publicly, and tied directly to performance evaluations. An independent oversight board, something civil rights organizations in Alexandria had been requesting for 6 years, was formally approved by the city council 8 days later. It passed unanimously. Nobody in that chamber wanted to be on the wrong side of the room when the vote was called. On the morning after the departmental overhaul was announced, Peter and Mary Wilson stood together on the steps outside the federal courthouse. They stood close, not performing unity for the cameras, but simply present with each other in the way that two people are when they have walked through something genuinely hard and come out the other side still standing together. Mary wore the same calm expression she always wore in public now, composed, clear-eyed, with a steadiness that had cost her more than anyone watching would ever fully know. Reporters called out questions from the bottom of the steps. Microphones reached toward them. Peter spoke without notes. He thanked his legal team. He named the witnesses, Diane, Raymond, Marcus, and all the others, by first name, deliberately and specifically, because he wanted the record to show that this verdict did not belong to him alone. It belonged to every person who had stepped forward when stepping forward was hard. He thanked Mary, briefly and directly, in the way of a man who saves his real words for private. And then he said something that every outlet would quote in their coverage that afternoon. He said the $4.7 million was not the point. The point was the 17-year-old boy who could now walk home. He did not take questions after that. He and Mary walked down the steps together, got into their car, and drove home. That evening, Peter Wilson opened a new case file on his desk. A family in Georgia had reached out to his nonprofit 2 weeks prior. A father was detained at a gas station. No cause. The same shape. The same story. He had told them he would call when the trial was over. He picked up the phone. If Peter Wilson's story moved you, smash that like button and subscribe, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Justice doesn't get old, and neither do we.